When 8-year-old Leo told the quiet biker that he slept better when it rained, he did not know he was handing the man a key. He did not understand that his simple, honest words were a flare fired in the dark, visible only to a man trained to look for signs of a fire smoldering just out of sight. The biker, a man known only as Sticks, felt the boy's confession land in his gut like a stone. The child's strange preference for stormy nights over sunny days set off a chain of events that would unravel a quiet tragedy hidden in a small town, turning a series of quiet afternoons at the public library into a mission that would save a life and redefine the meaning of family, brotherhood, and the gentle sound of falling rain. The Millwater Public Library was a sanctuary of silence. It smelled of aging paper, lemon-scented wood polish, and the faint, dusty perfume of forgotten stories. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through the tall arched windows, illuminating the hushed reverence of the space. It was a place of peace, a harbor from the noise of the world outside. For most, it was a temporary escape. For some, it was the only safe place they knew. Frank Carter, though no one had called him that in 20 years, found his own peace there. To the world, and to his brothers in the Iron Sentinels Motorcycle Club, he was Sticks. At 52, he was a mountain of a man, carved from granite and etched with the stories of a life lived hard. His arms, covered in faded ink, were thick as tree limbs. A graying beard cascaded over the leather cut that bore his club's insignia, a stoic, iron-willed eagle. He looked like the kind of man who would break a place like this just by breathing too loudly. But Sticks was not there to cause trouble. He was a retired firefighter, a man who had spent 3 decades running into burning buildings while others ran out. The chaos and the adrenaline had been his life's rhythm, but now, in the quiet of his retirement, he sought a different kind of order. He came to the library to read old manuals, to study the schematics of vintage motorcycles, a passion that required the same focus and patience as dismantling a bomb. The library was his workshop of the mind. He had seen the boy before. It was impossible not to. In a place of transient visitors, the boy was a permanent fixture, as much a part of the library as the circulation desk or the Dewey Decimal System. His name, Sticks learned from a whispered conversation with the librarian, was Leo. He was 8 years old, but his eyes held the weary gravity of a much older soul. Leo was small for his age, with a thatch of brown hair that always seemed to need a trim and clothes that hung from his thin frame as if they belonged to an older brother he didn't have. He was always alone. He would arrive shortly after school, let out and settle into a worn armchair in the children's section, a book open on his lap. But Sticks noticed he rarely turned the pages. He just sat, still and silent, watching the clock on the wall, his posture a study in quiet endurance. The boy was a puzzle, and Sticks, a man who had spent his life reading the subtle language of smoke and stress fractures in steel beams, found himself studying the faint, invisible cracks in Leo's composure. He knew what a happy kid looked like, loud, messy, full of restless energy. He also knew, with a certainty that chilled him, what a scared kid looked like. A scared kid looked just like Leo. Silent. Watchful. Waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Sticks began to observe a pattern. Every evening, just before the library closed, a man would burst through the doors to collect the boy. He was a stark contrast to the library's quiet grace. The man, whom Sticks would later learn was Leo's stepfather, Rick, was a frayed wire of a human being. He moved with an agitated energy, his face perpetually pinched in a mask of irritation. He smelled of stale cigarettes and impatience. Rick never entered the children's section. He would stand at the entrance, jangling his keys, and hiss the boy's name. "Leo! Let's go!" Now his tone was never kind, never patient. It was the sound of a man swatting away a persistent annoyance. And every time, Leo would flinch. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, a tightening of his shoulders, a slight dip of his head. He would slide out of the chair without a word, his book left behind, and hurry towards the man, his head bowed as if expecting a blow that never came, but always threatened. The sight coiled something cold and tight in Sticks's chest. It was an old feeling, the same one he'd get just before a roof was about to collapse, a sixth sense for imminent danger that had been honed by years of walking into disasters. He had seen that flinch in the eyes of battered women and frightened children at the scenes of domestic calls, a silent scream his firefighter training had taught him to recognize. He saw what others missed because he knew exactly what he was looking for. He started timing his visits to coincide with Leo's. He would sit at a large table in the reference section, pretending to be absorbed in a book on engine repair, but his attention was always fixed on the small boy in the armchair. He watched as other kids came and went with their parents, laughing and sharing whispers over colorful picture books. He watched as Leo sat in his bubble of solitude, a ghost in a room full of life. One rainy Tuesday, the confirmation he hadn't known he was waiting for finally came. A storm had rolled in, a sudden, violent downpour that lashed against the library's tall windows. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the rhythmic drumming of the rain became the building's heartbeat. Most people grumbled about the weather, pulling their collars tight and lamenting their lack of an umbrella. But as Styx packed his bag to leave, he saw Leo standing by the window. For the first time, the boy wasn't wearing his usual mask of quiet dread. A small, genuine smile touched his lips as he watched the water stream down the glass. He looked peaceful. Styx walked over, his heavy boots making soft thuds on the worn carpet. He stood beside the boy, a giant next to a sapling, and looked out at the deluge. Nasty weather, Styx rumbled, his voice a low gravel. Leo didn't look at him, but he answered, his voice soft and thin. I like it, oh yeah. Styx asked, genuinely curious. Most people don't. I sleep better when it rains, Leo said, his eyes still fixed on the storm outside. The statement was so simple, so odd. Styx's instincts, dormant but never gone, flared to life. This was it. This was the piece that didn't fit. He kept his voice casual, gentle. Why's that, little man? Leo finally turned to look up at him. His eyes were wide and startlingly clear, and in their depths, Styx saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded. The boy took a small breath before he spoke the words that would change everything. Because when it rains, he whispered, as if sharing a profound secret, the noise covers up the yelling. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The gentle drumming of the rain suddenly sounded like thunder. Every protective instinct in Styx's body, every ounce of the firefighter who had carried children from smoke-filled rooms, surged to the surface. His blood went cold. The boy wasn't just neglected, he was living in a war zone. The rain was his only shield, the storm his only peace. In that moment, Styx knew he couldn't just walk away. The library was no longer his sanctuary, it had become his watchtower. The decision was not a conscious thought, it was a reflex. It was the same instinct that had made him run into a collapsing structure on a gut feeling that one person was still trapped inside. The risk of being wrong, of being seen as a meddling old biker, was nothing compared to the risk of being right and doing nothing. He was going to intervene. He just had to figure out how. He couldn't go to the police, not yet. He had nothing but a child's cryptic words and a bad feeling. He needed more. So he began a quiet campaign, a one-man operation of subtle kindness. His daily visits to the library became less about motorcycle manuals and more about Leo. He started bringing an extra snack in his little bag, a granola bar, a bag of apple slices, a juice box. He would sit at his usual table, and when Leo was absorbed in his silent vigil, Styx would walk by the boy's chair on his way to the restroom or the water fountain. With a practiced sleight of hand, he would leave the snack on the small table next to the armchair, never saying a word, never making eye contact. He would return to his seat and watch from the corner of his eye. The first time, Leo stared at the granola bar for nearly an hour, his small brow furrowed in suspicion. He looked around, trying to find its source. But eventually, with furtive glances, his small hand shot out and snatched it. He unwrapped it slowly, quietly, and ate it in tiny, deliberate bites, as if trying to make it last forever. A small victory. It was the first step. This became their silent ritual. Styx would provide, and Leo would accept. No words were ever exchanged, but a fragile thread of trust began to form between the giant, tattooed biker and the forgotten little boy. Styx learned that Leo loved apple juice and hated raisins. He learned that the boy's favorite books were about planets and stars, a silent longing for escape written in his choice of literature. One afternoon, Styx brought a small, detailed model of the solar system he'd found at a hobby shop. He left it in the box on the table next to Leo. The boy's eyes, when he saw it, widened with a light Styx had never seen in them before. For the first time since their conversation by the window, Leo looked directly at him from across the room. He didn't smile, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a thank you. It was a connection. The quiet truce, however, was destined to be broken. The situation escalated on a Thursday evening. Styx was getting ready to pack up when Rick burst through the library doors, his face a thundercloud of fury. He was later than usual, and his anger radiated off him in palpable waves. "Leo," he snarled, his voice cutting through the library's sacred hush. Heads turned. The librarian at the front desk looked up, her expression tightening with concern. Leo, who had been carefully assembling the tiny model of Saturn, flinched violently. He scrambled to put the planets back in the box, his hands trembling. "I told you to be waiting outside." Rick stomped over to the children's section, ignoring the disapproving glares. He reached Leo's chair and grabbed the boy's upper arm, his fingers digging into the thin bicep. He yanked Leo to his feet, scattering the plastic planets across the floor. "You think I have all night? You're making me late." The boy cried out, a small, sharp yelp of pain. That was it. The line had been crossed. Styx moved. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply rose to his full height, a silent, uncoiling force of nature, and placed himself directly in Rick's path to the exit. He folded his massive arms across his chest and waited. He was a wall of leather and righteous anger. Rick stopped short, his momentum broken. He looked up at Styx, his own anger momentarily eclipsed by surprise and a flicker of fear. "Get out of my way," he spat, trying to sound intimidating. Styx didn't move. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, were locked on the man's hand, still clamped around Leo's arm. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Let go of the boy's arm. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with the calm, unshakable authority of a man who had faced down death itself and had not blinked. For a tense moment, the library held its breath. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall. Rick's face cycled through a series of emotions, defiance, rage, and finally, a sliver of primal fear. He was looking at a man who had nothing to lose and a boy to protect. He was outmatched. With a curse, Rick released Leo's arm. He gave the boy a vicious shove forward. "Get in the car," he hissed, his eyes still locked on Styx. He tried to project an air of authority, but his retreat was palpable. He skirted around the biker, dragging Leo behind him, and stormed out of the library. Styx watched them go, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and dread. He had won the battle, but he knew the war was far from over. He had shown his hand. Rick now saw him as a threat, and that could make things infinitely more dangerous for Leo. He walked over to where the model planets lay scattered on the floor. He knelt down, his old knees protesting, and began picking them up one by one. Jupiter. Mars. The pale blue dot of Earth. He placed them carefully back in their box. He had to end this. Tonight. Styx walked out of the library into the cool evening air. He saw Rick's battered sedan peeling out of the parking lot, its engine sputtering in protest. He didn't hesitate. He swung a leg over his Harley, the familiar weight of the machine a comfort. The engine roared to life with a turn of the key, a deep, throaty growl that promised retribution. He followed them. He kept a safe distance, his single headlight a phantom eye in their rearview mirror. He tracked them through the quiet suburban streets of Millwater to a run-down duplex on the forgotten side of town. The house was dark, the lawn overgrown with weeds, a broken-down washing machine rusting on the porch. It was a house that radiated neglect. He watched as Rick shoved Leo inside and slammed the door. A moment later, a single, dim light flickered on in a downstairs window. Sticks parked his bike a block away, in the shadows of an old oak tree, and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Dave Miller. A police sergeant. A man whose life Sticks had saved years ago, pulling him from the twisted wreckage of a patrol car. He dialed the number. Miller, a gruff voice answered. "Dave, it's Frank Carter," Sticks said, using his real name for the first time in years. It Sticks. There was a pause on the other end, then recognition. "Sticks. Long time. Everything okay?" "Not really," Sticks said, his voice low and steady. He laid it all out, the boy at the library, the neglect, the fear, the conversation about the rain, the stepfather's aggression. He gave him the address. He didn't exaggerate, didn't add his own anger to the story. He just gave the facts, a professional report from one first responder to another. "I've got a bad feeling, Dave. A real bad one. I think you need to send a car over for a welfare check." He could hear Miller typing on a keyboard. "A firefighter's gut feeling is better than most eyewitnesses," the sergeant said. "I trust your instincts, Frank. I'll have a unit swing by within the hour. You stay put." "Don't engage, wouldn't dream of it," Sticks lied. He had no intention of leaving until he knew the boy was safe. He sat there in the dark, the rumble of his bike silenced, and watched the house. 40 minutes later, a patrol car rolled silently down the street, its lights off. 2 officers got out and walked up to the front door. They knocked. From his vantage point, Sticks couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the tension in the officer's posture. He saw Rick arguing, waving his hands dismissively. Then, the door opened wider, and the officers stepped inside. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Sticks's life. He waited, his knuckles white on his handlebars. Finally, the front door opened again. One of the officers emerged, speaking into his shoulder radio. A few minutes later, another patrol car arrived, followed by an unmarked sedan. Then, he saw him. One of the officers led Leo out of the house. The boy was wrapped in a blanket, his small face pale in the flashing blue and red lights that now painted the street in strobing colors. He was clutching the box with the model solar system in his hands. He looked terrified, but as he was guided to the back of the unmarked car, he glanced down the street, his eyes searching the darkness. Their eyes met. For a brief, eternal second, the boy and the biker looked at each other across the distance. Sticks gave a slow, deliberate nod. "A promise. You're safe now." Leo didn't respond, but his shoulders, for the first time, seemed to relax. He got into the car without a fight, the door closing with a soft, final click. He was out. Sticks watched as Rick was led from the house in handcuffs, his angry protest swallowed by the night. He waited until the last car pulled away, leaving the street in silence once more. Only then did he start his engine and ride away, the heavy weight in his chest finally beginning to lift. The call from Sergeant Miller came the next morning. "You were right, Frank," he said, his voice heavy. "It was worse than we thought. The place was a pigsty, no food in the fridge. The stepfather was drunk, and the mom. Well, she's a victim in her own way, but she wasn't protecting him. The kid was sleeping on a pile of laundry in a room with a broken window. Severe neglect, emotional abuse. You got him out of a living nightmare. CPS has him. His safer the validation was a relief, but it wasn't a victory." Sticks knew the boy's journey was just beginning. He asked Miller for the name of the CPS caseworker, and after pulling a few strings, he was granted permission to visit Leo at the emergency foster home. He didn't ride his Harley. He took his old pickup truck instead, wanting to appear less intimidating. He didn't bring toys or candy. He brought one thing. On his way, he stopped at an electronics store and bought a small, simple white noise machine. He found Leo sitting in the living room of a clean, quiet house, cared for by a kind-faced foster mother. The boy was watching cartoons, but his eyes were vacant. He looked lost. Sticks knelt in front of him. "Hey, little man," he said softly. Leo looked at him, his expression unreadable. Sticks held out the box. "I brought you something." He opened it and took out the small machine. He plugged it into a nearby wall socket and pressed a button. A list of sounds appeared on a small screen: ocean waves, forest night, gentle breeze. He scrolled through until he found the one he was looking for: rainfall. He turned it on. A soft, gentle sound of rain filled the room, a steady, soothing patter. It was the sound of peace, not of a storm. "Thought this might help you sleep," Sticks said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Even when the sun is shining." Leo looked from the machine to Sticks's face. His lower lip trembled. He didn't say anything. Instead, he launched himself forward and wrapped his skinny arms around Sticks's thick neck, burying his face in the rough leather of his jacket. Sticks froze for a second, unused to such contact, before his own massive arms came up and gently encircled the boy, holding him as if he were made of glass. That night, for the first time in his memory, Leo slept through the night without needing a real storm to chase away the monsters. He had the sound of the rain, a gift from his guardian angel, a reminder that someone had heard his silent plea and had ridden through the dark to bring him to safety. It was the first step on his long road to healing. 5 years can change everything. A sapling can become a young tree. A wound can become a scar. A scared little boy can become a confident young man. Leo, now 13, stood on the stage of his middle school auditorium. He was taller, his face had lost its childish roundness, and he wore a crisp shirt and tie. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the packed audience, and began his speech for the debate club finals. His voice was clear, strong, and unwavering. He spoke of justice, of community, and of the responsibility people have to look out for one another. In the third row, a giant of a man with a graying beard and a leather vest sat watching. Sticks felt a swell of pride so immense it threatened to crack his ribs. He was a permanent fixture in Leo's life now, an honorary uncle. Leo had been adopted by a wonderful family a year after his rescue, a couple who understood his past and embraced his unlikely bond with the biker who had saved him. They called him Uncle Sticks, and he was at every birthday, every school play, and every parent-teacher conference. After the debate, which Leo's team won, Sticks was waiting outside. "You were good up there, kid," he rumbled, clapping a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "Thanks, Sticks," Leo beamed. I wasn't even nervous. On his nightstand at home, Leo still kept the small white noise machine. He didn't need it anymore to cover up the sounds of yelling. His new home was filled with laughter and kindness. But he turned it on every night. The sound of the rain was no longer a shield, it was a reminder. It was the sound of being seen. "I still have the machine you gave me," Leo said one afternoon as they sat on a park bench, sharing a pizza. "I'll never get rid of it. It reminds me that even when you feel like you're whispering, someone out there can hear you." The change in Leo was not the only ripple effect from that rainy day at the library. Inspired by what had happened, Sticks had gone to his brothers in the Iron Sentinels. He told them the whole story, his voice cracking with emotion as he described the small, lonely boy who found peace only in storms. The bikers, men who were more comfortable with engine grease and bar fights than with feelings, were moved. They understood injustice. They understood protecting the vulnerable. That day, they decided to do more. They started a charity, a non-profit they called the Sentinel Project. They partnered with local libraries, schools, and community centers to create safe zones for kids like Leo, children who had nowhere safe to go after school. They stocked shelves with snacks and drinks. They donated school supplies. And most importantly, they provided a presence. 2 or 3 bikers would sit quietly in a designated corner of the library every afternoon, reading or talking softly. They became the silent guardians, the watchful protectors. Kids knew that if they were scared or needed help, they could go to the men in the leather vests. The community, at first wary of the gruff-looking men, soon came to see them as the city's most unlikely and most dedicated guardians. The Iron Sentinels, a club once known for its fearsome reputation, became known for its fierce compassion. Years passed. Leo graduated high school with honors and was accepted into a university with a full scholarship. He wanted to become a social worker, to spend his life being the person for other kids that Styx had been for him. One cool autumn afternoon, Styx and Leo, now a young man of 18, sat on that same park bench. A light drizzle began to fall, speckling the pavement and releasing the earthy scent of wet soil. Leo closed his eyes and smiled, turning his face up to the sky. "Still my favorite weather," he said, his voice full of a deep, unshakable peace. Styx looked at the young man beside him, strong, kind, and full of promise. He thought of the terrified little boy by the library window and the long, winding road that had led them here. He put a heavy arm around Leo's shoulders, a gesture of profound love and pride. The rain fell gently around them, a quiet blessing. "Mine too, kid," Styx said, his voice a low, contented rumble. Mine too. The rain was no longer about hiding from the noise. It was about remembering the quiet kindness that had washed the fear away, and the man who had been willing to listen to the storm in a little boy's heart.